Good day, everyone, and welcome to this last webinar from the International Association for Volunteer Effort in its Leadership for Volunteering, reflecting on the COVID-19 Experience series, where we've been exploring three key volunteering topics highlighted by IAVE research regarding the experience and response of leadership for volunteering organizations during the pandemic. My name is David Stiers, and I'm a former board member of IAVE, and I serve as the coordinator of the Volunteer Groups Alliance, which serves as the focal point for the volunteer stakeholder group at the United Nations. I'm presuming most of you know IAVE, but if you are new, it is a global NGO that creates a more just and sustainable world by enabling the leaders, organizations, and environments that empower volunteers. And next month, it will be hosting the 26th IAVE World Volunteer Conference in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates from the 24th through the 27th of October. If you've never been to a World Volunteering Conference, I would encourage you to try to attend. This will be the first in-person one in 4 years because of the pandemic, and I know it'll be an exciting time for everyone together in Abu Dhabi. So we would look forward to seeing you there. In this webinar series, we have already explored in May and June volunteering and disaster preparedness, the role of and the relationship between the not-for-profit and corporate sectors, as well as partnership and collaboration for volunteering, and the benefits of working together to achieve better outcomes. In today's webinar, we'll reflect on evidence gathered and findings to inform future volunteering operations and practice. What works and what should be our future priorities? With a focus on creating an enabling environment, we will be drawing on several research reports, links to which we'll put in the chat, and these include Leadership for Volunteering, the COVID-19 Experience, published in 2021, and the associated briefing paper on creating an enabling environment for volunteering. Also, there was a recently published IAVE paper on future trends in volunteering. And so these three sources are backgrounds to inform the presentations today. Because from the research and our own daily work with volunteers, we know how important it is to create enabling environments for volunteering and the key components required, as well as the challenges in making this happen. We also know how providing a supportive environment for volunteering creates real opportunities for citizens to get involved in creating positive change within their communities. Today, we'll be considering the relationships between government and civil society and how this can help or hinder volunteer engagement and development, and how partnerships and collaboration can be a catalyst for enabling volunteering to flourish. We have 4 wonderful speakers today, and their presentations will share a diversity of volunteering leadership voices to showcase their knowledge and experience. And the presentations will be followed by a moderated discussion and questions and answers from you. So while you're listening, feel free to put in the Q&A any questions you have, or I'll be asking for them at the end of the 4 presentations. And again, we are thrilled to have our 4 presenters today, representing a diversity of, again, perspectives and geography, from Helene Perold in South Africa to Pibwa Kamaruko in Germany, Giselle Mendez from the Caribbean, and Samuel Torre from Sierra Leone. And so we will start today with Helene, and I would like to welcome her to talk about her research as director of the Helene Perold Associates based in Johannesburg, South Africa. And she will set the context of what is meant by an enabling environment and highlight the key components that deliver an enabling environment for volunteering, and reflect on some of the current and future global challenges to creating the environment that enable volunteering to flourish. Since 1993, Helene has developed extensive research and evaluation experience in South Africa, Argentina, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Costa Rica, Madagascar, Mozambique, Namibia, the USA, and Zimbabwe. And she was the founder and executive director of BASESA, a nonprofit research organization that worked from 2003 to 2013 to build an evidence base in the field of volunteering and civil service in Southern Africa. So thank you so much, Helene, for being with us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, David, and good afternoon, good morning to everyone who's joined us. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be with you today. I'm just going to share my screen and there we go, so that I can pick up on my presentation. Okay, is that working? Yeah? Good. All right. So just to set the context for creating an enabling environment for volunteering, and here I'm drawing a great deal on the research that we did for EAVE that has been mentioned, and Jessica shared the links in the chat. Let's look at three things. What do we mean by an enabling environment for volunteering? And what are the factors that shape an enabling environment for volunteering? And I'll just mention some. Obviously, there are many, and it's quite a complex terrain, but in the interest of time, I'll keep it short. And thirdly, what are the challenges, some of the challenges to creating a volunteering enabling environment? So, if we look at the question, what is an enabling environment? I've drawn on UNV's definition of an enabling environment for volunteering works to maximize the benefits of volunteering for development outcomes and minimize the risks for volunteers. And that's a very broad statement, but what they've helped us with is some underlying principles, which include the freedom to volunteer, gender equality, the safety and security of all volunteers, and the recognition of volunteer groups. And clearly that takes many forms as well. So from our research, it was clear that there are many different volunteering contexts, and each of these will make different demands for an enabling environment. For example, in some countries, there's a predominance of informal volunteering in many, many countries, often poorly resourced. And I think one of the things that COVID did was it lifted the lid and made visible the very high levels of informal volunteering that suddenly came to the fore as people tried to help each other within the context of COVID-19. In some countries, there's a prevalence of formalized volunteering with well-developed volunteer infrastructure. And very often that happens, it's most visible in developed countries around the world, but not exclusively. There's the question of the influence of regional culture. For example, during our research for EAVE, the study showed that in Latin America, a number of the the leaders of the volunteer leadership organizations spoke about the importance of regional collaboration, and in some cases actually feel very strongly about demonstrating the regional culture and nature of their work in the GNVL network. There's also the role of government. Does it provide recognition? Does it support volunteering? If so, in what way? But what about governments that are hostile to civic action? And then there's the issue of corporate social awareness and action, and the extent to which employee volunteering interfaces with other forms of volunteering and transformation and development in society. So it is quite a complex terrain. Many people spoke about a volunteer ecosystem. And this is quite a useful way of looking at the environment. But let's first look at what does an ecosystem mean. And I've drawn here, I borrowed from the internet, a very simple graphic showing a wetland within which the different components function as an ecosystem. The components function in relation to each other, with the context mainly being the water, the land, and the sun. And within that, there are many different life forms and complementary organisms that are living their lives. So if we look at that now in relation to, well, what does a volunteer ecosystem look like? You see the complexity of the different components. You have communities, you have civil society and the state, you have the private sector, various education and social institutions, often linked into the state, but often within the context of civil society or the private sector. And each of these have different roles. It was interesting that in our study, there was a lot more collaboration with local government. Sometimes the attention is mainly on links with national government, but both are very important agencies. And then within civil society, I don't have to tell you, there are voluntary involving organizations that take many different forms, CSO, social movements, non-governmental organizations, international ones, and so on. So what happens then is that the ecosystem is an environment in which the volunteer involving organizations coalesce around mutual interests and goals and are able to synergize their efforts and build trust across a diversity of social, economic, and political actors. These are big concepts, but there was a great deal of evidence of each of these within the study, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute. But just to say that the drive to build cohesive volunteer ecosystems in different countries suggested that, and continues to suggest, that volunteer leadership organizations are taking a holistic and strategic approach to strengthening volunteering as a component of civil society action. So let's look at that. What are the factors then that shape an enabling environment for volunteering? The first one, and maybe the biggest, is the notion of cross-sectoral cooperation and partnerships. And I've pulled out just 3 areas to talk to today. The first one is the purposes of cross-sectoral cooperation. And here are 2 examples, one from Peru, which sees it as a form of creating social capital and building trust between the different social actors in order to strengthen democracy. And you see there the links within the ecosystem of the players, the actions, and the purpose. And similarly, the second one, which was from a survey respondent, talked about working collaboratively to explore challenges and develop solutions. So again, it has a very clear purpose. The second one I wanted to share was about organizational positioning for collaboration. Some VLOs, volunteer leadership organizations, saw themselves as the voice of the sector, representing the sector, speaking on its behalf. But in others, there were different approaches. For example, in Morocco, CMV talked about their involvement in participatory advocacy. Participatory advocacy that involves civil society and the other actors, especially the public actor, namely government. And then from Kenya, where VIO society has been heavily involved over many years in developing policy with government and the legislation that will implement that policy. They talked about wanting something that would create a sense of ownership among the citizenry, a bottom-up movement, not the usual top-down that governments very often do. And then the third factor that I wanted to look at was the engagement with government. 88% of the VLO respondents said that the volunteering environment needs to be strengthened by policymakers. But of course, that is a negotiation within that ecosystem. but the policy that supports volunteering is a critical factor. And within the context of COVID, they actively sought partnerships with national and local government, as I said, the purpose being to increase their scale and impact, the scale and impact of their activities, and also to unlock resources. And then, sorry, I've just gone back on that. All right, never mind. And then there were many examples of organizations lobbying and advising government, designing programs, implementing national strategies, and there was some success in changing government practice to extend social support services to communities in need. The second issue was to improve organizational practice for capacity for strategic leadership, negotiation, and quality assurance. And here we had some interesting insights from, for example, Peru Voluntario, who's saying, yes, we want the volunteer in ecosystem because that increases the chances of making a big impact and generates funds. And where people have capacity, but they have to learn it. It's not like you're born knowing. In the case of Points of Light, they talked about seeing part of their role as benchmarking excellence in the sector. And related to that, for 76% of survey respondents, the promotion of quality standards for volunteering became a very important part of their work, more so than before, owing to the pandemic. Thirdly, there's the need to produce research and information on common issues and strategies. You'll remember that one of the points that I made earlier about the notion of an ecosystem was to be able to synergize efforts, to coalesce around mutual interests and goals. Now, if one's not doing research and producing information, how are people going to know about you? How are they going to know what you're doing? How are they going to be able to engage organizations across that spectrum and develop strategies? And my colleague Jacob Marty had a really wonderful comment on this, saying, he talked about ideas factories. In many cases, alliances and networks act as ideas factories for members to generate and share knowledge on common issues and strategies. And I think that notion of small factories, groupings of people, generating ideas and finding solutions, developing new programs is very powerful. And then finally, I wanted to share with you the factor of pursuing innovation. This happens through networks and will continue to. It involves building effective partnerships with multilateral development agencies and regional intergovernmental organizations. Not only that, it involves collaboration across regions through regional structures developed to support national volunteer networks and organizations. We found interesting evidence of that as well. And we suggested that it's important to consider best practice opportunities and challenges in corporate volunteering programs as well as a way of supporting innovation, going through those ideas factories and generating resources to do that. Now, what are the challenges in creating an enabling environment for volunteering? Well, Alice Chadwick-Egalali described it as a constellation of crises that we are currently involved in. They are social, they are economic, health, and environmental challenges. They're very familiar to us, and we did see how COVID disrupted so much of what we were doing and how climate change has become a massive, massive challenge in our faces right now. We also see, and COVID exacerbated this, persistent inequality, which is prompting the drive for greater inclusivity in decision-making, program design, access to technology, and resourcing of our volunteer campaigns, our volunteer strategies, and our volunteer programs. But I wanted to pick up on two in particular. The one is the complexity of engaging with government, and the other one is resourcing the volunteer sector. So the complexity of engaging with government, and I know Tapia was going to share with us very, very interesting and important information that the State of the World Volunteering Report uncovered in their research and that they reported on last year. But the difficulty is that recognition by government does not always produce support for volunteer involvement. One of the comments was that volunteering needs to come out of the policy shadows, particularly in relation to present social and economic crises. And I think there was a comment by one informant that the value of volunteering to some extent will be assessed in terms of to what extent can it actually alleviate people's the way they are dealing with social and economic crisis, food insecurity, joblessness, social dislocation, all these factors that we are now so aware of. And the dialogue with government is critical to pursuing inclusivity policy and practice, not only in the volunteer sector, but in other spheres of government influence. Thirdly, there was evidence of government ministries marginalizing volunteer involving organizations in rolling out COVID essential services. Sometimes the ministries would do their own thing. They would recruit their own volunteers. They wouldn't take account of the expertise in the volunteer sector. And in the view of one informant from Australia, that demonstrates a poor understanding of volunteering from a structural perspective. And here we're talking about duplication. We're talking about, as I said, ignoring levels of expertise and good practice in the volunteer sector. It points to the vulnerability of the volunteer sector within government practice, which sometimes chooses to ignore it. And then, of course, there's the point that came from Mozambique, where the volunteer sector has recognition, very strong recognition from government, but in general, they don't get the financial support, which makes it very, very difficult for them to support government in its development objectives. And then we need greater protection for volunteer health and safety. I think COVID demonstrated that very strongly. And again, issues of insurance and various other mechanisms to give volunteers the protection that they need often relate to regulations or legislation or policy that government can enact and will provide the sector with an enormous level of support. And then, of course, there are the issues of power relations between the volunteer sector and government in a context of contestation. One perspective that came out very strongly was that where there is partnership, where there is collaboration, there is a risk that the volunteer leadership organization or network or individual organization will be deflected from its mission and vision. So it may agree to work with government and embark on programs, but it may not approve of the way they are run. It may feel that certain participants are being excluded. It may feel that there's not enough rigor, that there's not enough protection. And the view was that in this case, the movement or the organization starts losing its own direction. And that is a difficult issue in terms of how one negotiates that, especially when the collaboration comes with resources. And then the last point I wanted to mention here was that where there is a lack of trust in government, volunteer leadership organizations face very, very difficult strategic choices. Do they work with the government that they do not agree with or that they disapprove of in whichever of the crises that are current that they need to act on? And if so, what do they choose to do? And in the report, we do demonstrate how, in some cases, there were very careful strategic decisions made. We will help you with technical support, but we will not undertake the recruitment for you because we will not give you the legitimacy that you will seek from this collaboration. And, I'm not going to go into any details, but I'm sure there are many of you who will know that in the context of hostility from government to civic action, this sort of dilemma is very real. And then let's talk about resources. And I really wanted to give you a little bit of information here from the study because it is such a difficult issue. So COVID restructured the volunteering landscape. And 65% of our survey's respondents said that some of the volunteer involving organizations they work with had ceased to operate or closed. And in some cases, these were larger volunteer involving organizations, very stable, having long histories that were weakened by funding cuts through the reprioritization of funding among donors as well as government. And on the other hand, some smaller organizations appeared to be more resilient, more flexible, able to change tack more quickly, develop new partnerships. Public funding for the volunteer sector is often unstable. It often depends on what party is in power. It depends on the bureaucrats or the government officials. Do they have any experience of volunteering? Do they understand the volunteer sector? And I was struck in Ireland, how Volunteer Ireland commented that the relationship they had developed with government, where they were being tasked with implementing the strategy to within the COVID context, was partly attributed to the fact that the minister in charge had previously worked in volunteering and really understood the sector and understood what it could produce. But every time there's an election, of course, one's got to learn and get to know the new, the officials who are now taking on the task of implementing legislation. And then finally, competition for funding within the volunteer sector, I think, is something we know. It becomes worse in a cash-strapped environment and in difficult economics contexts. And in some cases, we found in Latin America, for example, that the civil society organizations were actually having to compete with their own government for foreign donor support in a context of dire economic circumstances nationally, which again makes things very, very difficult. So what are some of the resourcing strategies that were suggested? The first was we found evidence of reconfiguring networks in order to pair smaller and larger organizations for greater impact. The organizations can reduce duplication and administrative costs by coming together and redefining what is needed in the sector. And then there's the issue of self-earned income as another string to a bow. If you're dependent on one resource for your funding, it makes things very, very risky. But 43% of the survey respondents said that in future volunteer programs, they thought would be resourced mostly through social enterprise and through earned income. But as I showed, 20% disagreed and 37% were neutral. So that's a difficult area, and it'd be interesting to know whether any of you have had any success in that regard. We felt that it would be important to draw lessons from partnerships between volunteer leadership organizations and governments that have worked well and learn from those and take what one can. And similarly, to consider how those organizations can build capacity development partnerships with multilateral development agencies and regional intergovernmental organizations. And then finally, two more, consider the examples of corporate volunteering partnerships that have and could enable resourcing. And finally, explore new areas of growth, especially structured partnerships with technology companies, given the increasing thrust of digitally enabled volunteering which is a potential growth area across the globe. And with that, I just wanted to conclude with 3 observations. One is that building an enabling environment for volunteering remains a work in progress. And 2, despite its destructive nature, COVID was a game changer in demonstrating the volunteer sector's capacity for resilience, strategic leadership, and innovation. But that in all spheres, thirdly, of the volunteer sector, collaboration through networks and strategic partnerships are the foundation for managing uncertainty and responding to rapid change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Helene, for all that great information, and as in the chat, great outcomes on the challenges, and important to point out the compliance to existing laws and regulations by civil society and greater good in our approach. So thank you for those comments. And I want to now welcome to our stage Tupiwa Kamuruko of the United Nations Volunteer Programs, UNV, to reflect on the recent State of the World's Volunteerism Report and the UNV's experience of working with national governments and what an enabling environment for volunteering looks like and the role of governments and NGOs play in making this happen. Tupiwa is a policy specialist and team lead on evidence and knowledge brokering with UNV and based in its headquarters in Bonn, Germany. And prior to his current assignment, he has worked in different UNV assignments, including being the regional manager for East and Southern based in Nairobi, Kenya. His work involved the promotion, advocacy, and integration of volunteering in development frameworks and as means of implementation for the Sustainable Development Agenda. So he's worked with member states and regional economic commissions, the UN, in strengthening evidence and research on volunteer mechanisms, including policy formation. So thank you so much for being with us today, Tupiwa, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, David. I don't know where to start because Helene is in South Africa, Johannesburg, and I'm in Bonn, but it looks like she kind of snooped on my presentation. She has covered almost everything, but nonetheless, look, the discussion on enabling environment for volunteering, what comes to mind are some of the factors that Helene has ably discussed. And for 2 slides, I'll try to discuss that next. Usually, what comes to mind when we discuss the environment of volunteering are issues related to policies, issues related to laws, issues related to standards, global standards or national or regional standards of volunteering, practices. But more interestingly, which is the focus of my discussion, are the barriers. When we benchmark 2001, the year of volunteering, a lot has happened. I think in the Global South, we've witnessed a very great interest in coming up with laws, with policies. As I see today, they are close to 84% of policies and laws that have come out of the advocacy and promotion from IYV 2001 until now. But when we look at these policies, we are saying, to what extent has this facilitated an enabling environment for volunteering? There are critical factors that we need to look into. And for, as I said, for purpose of this discussion, without going through what Helena said, we all agree that for laws, we need laws to enhance the governance of the sector. We need policies, strategies, plans, and action that effect change in the volunteering space. And equally, we need a framework to guide and support volunteering in terms of standards, because a number of times we've seen where we have questioned whether this is volunteering, whether this is philanthropy, whether this is service, what kind of service is this? In terms of practices, we've seen a number of practices, including thematic interests such as youth schemes, where volunteer practices and principles have been applied. But as I said, at the same time, we've seen barriers, which I think is the interest now of research and evidence to see how these barriers are contributing or they are restricting the environment of volunteering, particularly the disparities that they present on gender, on marginalized groups, particularly minorities. And then finally, maybe I'll talk as well about data, the lack of investment on data on volunteering. Next, please. Helene, again, is focused and touched on these areas. I just put them without elaboration. I'll pick one of them, that the volunteering environment requires protection. We've seen where people or communities or organizations, briefcase organizations, have abused volunteering. And to the extent possible, it has tarnished the goodwill that comes with volunteering. Funding. When we talk about volunteering, some people, or sometimes we think volunteering is cheap or just come on its own. And the funding has not been properly discussed, particularly from the side of government. I've been based in Kenya before, and when we supported the Kenyan government to come up with a volunteering policy, for the first time we saw a member state allocating resources. During that year, I can't remember, it would be 2014, close to 130,000 allocated to the volunteering sector. I think this is massive, considering that sometimes the law or the policy itself is a shelf document. I'll talk about that. Then in terms of the environment, there are issues of participation. The State of the World Volunteering Report talks about inclusiveness. Sometimes these are the issues that we notice and observe, including ownership, recognition, effectiveness, and innovation, which are some of the issues that I'll discuss within the context of the State of the World Volunteering Report. Next, please. Having said that, my position, or I'm coming from a situation where I would like to discuss enabling environment a bit away from the traditional focus and scope of policies and laws. I know these are very important. For example, I know that government will not take an action if there's no policy environment, if there's no law that requires it to do something, if not anything about something. So enabling environment is important from the law side, from the policy side. But to what extent have these laws and policies facilitated volunteering? I'll give you an example. I've been doing some mapping of countries that enacted laws and developed policies, and to what extent these governments or member states have integrated elements of volunteering in sectoral development plans, in sectoral development strategies. Very limited. Then the question comes to mind, so why do we need the policies? Why do we need the law? If the policies cannot influence planning as means of implementation, or cannot facilitate. So these are some of the issues that I think are important. Next, please. So in 2022, the United Nations Volunteers, UNV, embarked on very extensive research as part of the preparation of the State of the World's Volunteerism report. And in this report, there are findings and recommendations that talk to barriers through which volunteerism could either be constricted or facilitated. To those who are not familiar with this report, it is a flagship publication by the UN system, published every 3 years to inform and advocate on the role of volunteerism for peace and development efforts. And the 2022 report is actually the 4th in a series. We started producing these reports in 2015 on different trends, on different thematic areas of volunteering. I also want to mention that sometimes UN reports come in different forms, and people look at them from different perspectives, including the fact that probably they are based on secondary data from headquarters of organizations. But I want to confirm that the State of the World's Volunteering Report is based on case studies and research that was carried out in 20 countries, especially on the Global South. The Global South is simply because there's limited data and evidence and studies about volunteering, and it presents some very compelling evidence on the role of volunteerism as a means of solving global and local development challenges, including Agenda 2030 on sustainable development. Next, please. I also want to mention that when we look at this report, what comes to mind, this is a report, so what? This report, and there are questions that comes through. For example, how does the State of the World's Volunteerism Report findings help to create an enabling environment for volunteering? And what does the research and evidence create? How do they create avenues for a sustainable volunteering environment for the 21st century? Next, please. These are very important questions that were actually at the center of the conceptualization of the 2022 SWVR. In terms of the context, I think we all agree, more so on the COVID pandemic, that we are in a very difficult environment, a 21st century development environment of increasing inequalities, exclusion, poverty, climate change emergencies, and the COVID pandemic, which is still with us. Additionally, we're in a development discourse at the moment that is almost at a global reset, one that is looking at the new ways of doing business, a new social contract for a new era, where we are saying volunteerism can build more equal and inclusive societies. And here, as Helen has said, the endeavor for a new volunteering ecosystem. And the report looked also at new forms of collaboration, which will be the center of my discussion, and partnership between the government and volunteers, and how this can help to build a new social contract that can translate into a new volunteering environment. This is a bit further away from the traditional way of the scope of policies and legislation, where we have 80 policies and laws, that we still think we want to go beyond the policies, we want to go beyond the laws, and ensure that volunteering is integrated into national development plans and strategies for effectiveness. Next, please. Some of the key aspects that have come out of this report, which we all know, but I think for emphasis, we repeated them in this report, that volunteers are bridge builders and brokers. They understand their communities and the community's needs, and it can mediate between state partners and service users. This is very important, especially when volunteers are involved at the beginning, which is one of the models that I'll present. And equally, that volunteering helps people to shape the policies that affect them directly, identify priorities, and make sure that they are relevant to their needs and aspirations. Volunteering open up different ways for people to participate in civic affairs, and they focus on issues of concern to them. And the last point here is that volunteers help to innovate and create results that meet the needs of communities as defined by communities. These 4 points join to the need where you see volunteers being at the center of planning and implementation of development agenda, where they themselves understand issues better and the need, therefore, to involve them, not as an afterthought, but from the beginning of planning right up to the end of implementation. I would like to talk about 3 models that are discussed in the SWVR 2022. These are very critical. These models, they've been put together to see if the environment of volunteering can change if there is better collaboration between the state and volunteers, between governments and volunteers. Next, please. The first model is on deliberative governance, where it describes forums or space where volunteers can participate in dialogues and set strategic priorities and participate in decision-making. This is very important. It enables volunteers to take part in development planning and also to factor in the areas of decision-making. The deliberative governance model also allows volunteers from marginalized groups to have their voices heard and contribute their expertise and experience to influence or inform policies and decisions. Many times in development planning, we know that some marginalized groups' voices or even interest are at the tail end in terms of decision-making. But we are saying volunteers, if they come from these marginalized groups, can make a difference. And another point in the deliberative governance is that volunteers can help to ensure a sustainable solutions for inclusion if they're involved from the beginning. Next, please. Another element that is very important is the collaborative service delivery, which highlights that volunteers create, innovate, and collaborate with government in the design and implementation of and evaluation of public programs and services. It ensures that at least there's inclusivity and that these are aligned with their interests. They are not the interests that are designed with or without their inputs. And equally that volunteers act as information brokers. Imagine volunteers at the local and community level. And sometimes they have the possibility to get in touch or to meet with policymakers. They become information brokers and mediators. And their leadership and knowledge and expertise is recognized at the community level. They are the ones that the community refers to when something, especially when disasters strike. And within this model also, by working together to achieve beneficial results, this model assists in creating trust and accountability between marginalized groups and the government. Increasingly, whether groups are marginalized or they have no say, but increasingly they are coming up to say, look, hello, we also want our voice to be heard. We want to be part of the development process. Next, please. The last point is about on social innovation, which talks about volunteers being drivers of social innovation in the fact that they develop and implement new solutions for sustainable development challenges. The fact here is that most volunteers, they are committed from the heart, and to that extent that they drive social innovation and they develop and implement solutions right through. And if they're involved, they can make a difference. An additional point is that if they're allowed to drive social innovation, volunteers can be part of innovative platforms and technology that can promote and enhance government's understanding of marginalized communities' challenges and concerns. And through developing innovative approaches, volunteers can facilitate new ways of working, building networks, and helping rebalance equal power relations, and that's the essence of a new volunteering environment that can ensue. So some of these three models, they are clear away from the focus of policy, from laws, but barriers that we think if government, if NGOs, if practitioners are able to come together and address them, this will make a huge difference. Next, please. There are reflections that the report has put together that can be considered either by policymakers, by NGOs, or practitioners in the sector. One is to identify the barriers through research, especially about volunteering that marginalized communities face, and create access to make sure that disadvantaged groups are deliberately included. And also that when we discuss volunteering today, there are differences in terms of participation between men and women. There are discrepancies across countries, across regions, in terms of women and men's volunteer participation. And we are saying this is one area that the report has come up with, to say there's need to look and address issues of discrepancies, disparities that are across countries, and avoid reinforcing harmful gender norms and inequalities in volunteering. This is a big issue, especially when you look at the interest of women to do volunteer work. In most cases, they end up doing unpaid care work or unpaid work that does not count. But yet, when you look at research, most men who are involved in volunteering, they think this is professional engagement, for women it's not. Then the other important factor is to enable volunteers to use their expertise and knowledge to support and drive development. In most cases, volunteers are people with expertise. I've worked with volunteers who are medical doctors and who are expertise in their field, engineers. If they are allowed and given space, they can innovate, and by using their skills, their expertise, support and drive development. And lastly, in this sector of volunteering, I think it's coming up now that we are now focusing on research and data. And I think it's an area that we think we need to put more attention on, to invest in research and data in order to anticipate the impact of global trends on volunteering. Right now, we're talking about the future of work. How will the future of work impact on volunteering practice? These are important elements that the report, the SWVR report, has highlighted. At UNV, next please. At UNV, we've started to work on knowledge and evidence, and we set up the UNV Knowledge Portal since 2020. And whenever we have this opportunity to interact with like-minded communities like now, I just want to point to the Knowledge Portal of UNV. It is a one-stop shop with evidence, research findings, policies, and also it's a database with different and latest data sets and indicators on the measurement of volunteer work. And also it talks about enabling environment for volunteering from different perspectives that users can also have a look at. And lastly, the knowledge exchange is a facility that we continue to use to interact with peers and share insights and submit practices on various elements on volunteering. This is what I wanted to say, noting that the major point that I wanted to emphasize is that increasingly we want to acknowledge that we need the environment of policies and laws, standards and practices. But increasingly we need to do more research to bring out evidence, which evidence can address barriers that for a long time have restricted other community members to practice, to enter, to volunteer. And also some of them are stereotypes, especially on gender. And we see what is happening now on youth. Increasingly, volunteering is providing some avenue for employability skills development, not employment, but skills development for the transition to decent employment. So I think I want to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Weeva for that insightful look at both the need for policies, but also the need for those policies to be carried out and all the different barriers that we need to still overcome to create those enabling environments for volunteers. Next, I am pleased to welcome Giselle Mendez, the founder and managing director of the Volunteer Center of Trinidad and Tobago, to reflect on the development of volunteering in those island nations and the challenges faced and the opportunities that have been developed. Giselle inspires the best minds to volunteer their time to tackle the most pressing development challenges and mobilizes international networks and resources to escalate Caribbean volunteering. And through online volunteering, organizations like the Volunteer Center have been able to convene and manage large numbers of volunteers to reach those most at risk at being left behind. And the Volunteer Center team is unveiling the emerging role technology and artificial intelligence can play in scaling the reach and impact of volunteers. So thank you so much for being with us, and welcome, Giselle.
Thank you very much, David. A pleasure to be here today to share about the work of the Volunteer Center of Trinidad and Tobago in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean region. Next slide. So just to begin, in terms of speaking about an enabling environment for volunteering, for us at VCTT, it's really important to consider our context, our capacity as a small nonprofit in the Caribbean, having deep impact though, and how best we can leverage our context and capacity to promote and fuel volunteering. So just to give a brief overview of the work of the Volunteer Center, we exist to create a culture of care by placing people at the heart of positive change. We curate custom-built interventions that support the Sustainable Development Goals and connect skilled volunteers to those opportunities. Again, considering our context and capacity as a smaller nonprofit, a key question to us is in terms of the development of Trinidad and Tobago and the development of the Caribbean, what are some key areas of priority we can lend our strengths, we can lend our assets and resources to in terms of volunteer development. For us at VCTT, we have 4 key interventions that have helped us answer that question. The interventions include the Me to We Mentorship Program. So the state of children and youth in Trinidad and Tobago is a key area of priority and concern for us. We continue to underscore that pre-COVID, but following as well COVID, the state of our children and youth, their vulnerabilities continue to be exacerbated and they need continued and deeper support. So we provide that support through volunteers through the Me to We Mentorship Program. It's a many-to-one mentorship program that supports children and young people by connecting them with a family of volunteers, a family of positive support. And it really seeks to drive deeper around that principle of it takes a village to raise a child. The second key intervention we have in our portfolio is the Me to We Mentorship Platform. This program, project actually came about due to the successes we experienced from our core mentorship program. And it's also made possible through VCTT being part of the IAVE network. So we participated in the IAVE Ideathon in 2020, which was a partnership between IAVE and Emirates Foundation. We were successful in that initiative. And due to that, we are able to scale the impact we are having with the mentorship program by the implementation of a mentorship platform. Now, the mentorship platform is new territory for us. in terms of leveraging technology to scale the reach and impact of connecting more volunteers to children and young people who need support. It's currently under development and due to be launched over the next quarter. And really, again, underscores the importance of organizations like us who are smaller being a part of and supported by networks like IAVE. The third initiative we are working on is the Grown in East Port of Spain initiative. So food security is a growing challenge, of course, globally, but specifically in the Caribbean region as well. And the Grown in East Port of Spain initiative is our response to that. We are leveraging the skills of volunteers to support one of the most under-resourced communities in Trinidad and Tobago that are characterized by gang violence, unemployment, underemployment, low literacy levels, by implementing community gardens and using the output of that to create value-added products. And again, volunteers are the backbone of this. The fourth initiative that we work on is the Caribbean Volunteer Exchange Network. CVX, as we call our network, was launched a couple years into 2015 after VCTT's launch in 2012. And we have 7 partner volunteer involving organizations from the Caribbean region who work together with VCTT to exchange ideas, to exchange best practices, so we can better support each other in terms of volunteer development. The Caribbean context for volunteering is quite specific. We are cognizant as volunteer involving agencies of our capacity and context, and that opportunity to come together, to collaborate, to really hash out solutions, to innovate in view of our ever-evolving context as Caribbean organizations is ever more critical for us. These initiatives stand directly in support of some key SDGs, including quality education, zero hunger, partnerships for the goals. And again, just to underscore in view of our context and capacity for us, creating that enabling environment for volunteerism also really includes being very clear about how best to leverage our skills, context and capacity to support that broad agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. At VCTT, we currently have 2 part-time staff. The rest of our working team, it's all volunteers. So again, we need to be very, very focused in terms of how we undertake our work to develop volunteering. Next slide, please. So to just give some Caribbean context to this notion of developing an enabling environment for volunteering. For us, it's clear that there are multiple stakeholders that have a role, a critical role to play towards that mandate. As civil society organizations, again, we need to be conscious of what role we are effectively able to undertake. We also recognize that government has a critical role to play. The private sector has a critical role to play. And we carried out a very quick poll within our partner organizations who form part of the CVX network to just get a pulse of some of the key areas which impact that creating that enabling environment for volunteering. We basically wanted to find out from our Caribbean partners, does up-to-date research on volunteering exist in terms of research that is carried out on a national scale? Is there a national volunteering policy? While we recognize that different agencies may have a policy that covers a national scope, is there a national volunteering policy really dedicated to engendering and fueling volunteering? And another very important area that we look at is the role of the education sector. Our children and young people are the current and upcoming leaders who will be tasked with sustaining the culture of volunteering that we invest in and resource now, and are we laying the foundation for them to be successful, active citizens through the education system in terms of the formal curriculum. And of course, does leadership for volunteering organizations exist? What that quick poll, of course, underscored is in terms of from a policy level, from a research, data collection, volunteering being part of the formal curriculum. For most of our partner organizations, they did respond that it did not. These tools, these mechanisms were not in place. The good news is, of course, there are leadership for volunteering organizations, whether it exists at a state level in terms of government or within civil society. However, that broader support to really enrich and fuel that environment for volunteer development, there are notable gaps that are underscored there. At this point, I really do want to recognize the work of our Caribbean partners. Immediately coming to mind, I think of the work of IAVE in Haiti, of Do Nation Foundation and Volunteer St. Lucia in St. Lucia, of Cheap In Volunteer Center in St. Kitts and Nevis, and many more of our partners who work with within their limitations and resource constrictions to do really deep and impactful work as it pertains to volunteer development. Next slide, please. Just to go in a bit deeper in terms of some of the gaps that we have noted. So we speak of the State of the World Volunteering Report. For us, we ask ourselves, what is the state of volunteering in the Caribbean region? The research and data collection processes to help us answer that currently do not exist. There are conversations and interests around it, but at present, that level of data we do not have. Right, so certainly a gap there. Organizational capacities for volunteer development. Due to COVID, already vulnerable volunteering organizational structures were exacerbated, but our partners, including VCTT, we continue to persevere in spite of these challenges to ensure that the important work of volunteering can continue. So again, another gap in terms of organizational capacities. On a local level, in terms of Trinidad and Tobago, a lack of a national policy. This doesn't take away from other organizations who have very important policies that do feed into developing that ecosystem for volunteering, including Red Cross Trinidad and Tobago, ODPM, the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management, Habitat for Humanity, and so forth, right? In terms of VCTT, a key gap that we have noted is that the majority of our funding and resources to do the work that we continue to do comes from international organizations. Private sector support has been inconsistent, and of course, COVID has not helped that. And public sector support has been very fixed and focused. I do want to say that government has played a very important role in some of the work that we are able to do at VCTT. Due to our context and capacity, we really underscore the importance of collaborations, right? Collaborations being in place to support the work that we do. Our work in East Port of Spain would not be possible without the input of government agencies who have supported us with receiving approval for utilizing unused and underutilized spaces for volunteers to create those community garden spaces, and also accessing these communities, the community of East Port of Spain, which has some very challenging contexts, again, due to issues with gang violence and so forth. So collaboration, even though the support from government in terms of policy and so forth is certainly not what it should be, I do underscore that their support in other areas of our work has been fundamental for us being able to implement and do the work that we're currently doing. Another gap is, of course, understanding our context. Right now, we're a project-based organization, so we do not really have that national scale and national reach. However, again, we are very focused on doing the work that we are currently undertaking in terms of the projects identified and doing them very well, and leveraging the strengths of our multi-stakeholder steering committees to fill the gaps that we are unable to fill in terms of our current resources. In terms of opportunities, I was really encouraged by my colleague at the mention of addressing volunteer barriers through research. For us in Trinidad and Tobago, for us in the Caribbean, I do believe this is a critical opportunity area for us to look at. If we have that data, we can better guide and develop our projects, programs, and our work to better respond to the current context of volunteering in Trinidad and Tobago, and by extent the Caribbean region. I mean, when I think about the work of my colleague in Haiti in terms of Active, they're working in such challenging environments that very dynamic, constantly evolving, and that data really becomes the backbone upon which we can make better decisions. So in terms of an opportunity area, it's #1 on our priority list. Another opportunity is around our work with the Caribbean Volunteer Exchange Program. As mentioned, VCTT is working in 8 countries. This includes Trinidad and Tobago. And our priority over the past year, as we've come on the end of the pandemic, is to really support our partner organizations by connecting them to networks like IAVI with webinars, resources, connections to other organizations working on volunteering. So there is that level of knowledge exchange and opportunity for capacity development. We are very encouraged that 7 out of our 8 partner countries will be represented at this year's World Volunteer Conference. And that was a big area of priority and focus for us. Again, a key step forward in terms of ensuring that Caribbean volunteering is represented on that world stage. In spite of our limitations in terms of resources, the culture of volunteering in the Caribbean runs deep. The whole concept of mutual aid, helping our brothers and sisters, it's a big part of who we are as Caribbean people. However, we absolutely need additional resources and focus to better structure and build those capacities. So that Caribbean Volunteer Exchange, Good Deeds Day, IAVE partnership is an area of opportunity that we want to continue to feed into. I must say special thanks for Good Deeds Day, who has been our key ally in our work in the Caribbean region over the past 4 years. And as we move forward, we seek to deepen the work that we are doing through the network. In terms of Trinidad and Tobago, in 2020, there was the implementation of the Ministry of Youth Development and National Service, which we really endorse and use as a signal of the government really seeking to give priority to volunteering and national service. They have carried out a series of consultations with stakeholders involved in this work with a priority of developing and implementing a national service program that is evidence-based. We did contribute to that consultation process, and we look forward to see what comes out of this new mandate that was undertaken in 2020. Other key opportunity, partnerships. I did mention, and I'd like to underscore again, I did highlight the 4 key interventions and projects that VCTT works on. Again, these projects are fueled by multi-stakeholder steering committees. VCTT is very precise and clear in terms of our role, our strengths, and based on the specific goal of the intervention we are working on, we really rally around the best minds and key stakeholders and specialists who can add value to our area of work in terms of quality education, food security, and partnerships for the goals, so that they can also lend their strengths to that process. I must underscore that our successes are heavily driven by that model, and we stand by that steering committee approach, that multi-stakeholder steering committee approach to the work that we are doing in terms of volunteer development. Another key opportunity, I did explain the mentorship platform that we are currently rolling out, and it is absolutely new territory for us. And we are prioritizing this whole concept of ethical AI. Renee Cummings, who is an AI specialist in Trinidad and Tobago, and she does a lot of work globally in this regard, really promotes this concept of leveraging technology in an ethical way, in a way that is transparent, that is auditable, that is understandable towards our goals. What we are attempting to do with our mentorship platform, and we don't have the results as yet to share, is to use technology to really document, collate, map, and assess the progress of our mentors who partake in our mentorship program through the platform. So it will document their exchanges online and assess their shifts in words, whether their words become more positive through their mentorship journey being supported by volunteers. So again, leveraging technology, a key aspect of our work as we move forward. What I do want to state at this point is that this mentorship platform that we are building is subscription-based. So it's targeting other mentorship organizations interested in leveraging volunteers and connecting those volunteers to young people who need positive support. It's one of VCTT's strategies to not be as donor dependent as we are as a smaller nonprofit. And it's left to be seen the results of that process, but it is where we are at and it is what we are working on. Right. And of course, the evidence-based development of digital volunteering. We embarked on digital volunteering because of COVID. It wasn't part of our initial strategy, but we are seeing the strengths of it. We are seeing the great wins that came with online volunteering. At the peak of the pit of COVID, online volunteering really provided life-changing support to our children in Trinidad and Tobago. They were stuck at home in very challenging circumstances, and we can say through through our monitoring and evaluation processes, there were clear connections in terms of the support our volunteers were able to provide in that very difficult period for children. And
Great.
of course,
thank you so much, Giselle. And I know we're have about 10 minutes left, but I want to get to Sam Torre. And so we really appreciate all you've been doing to create a culture of placing people at the heart of positive change. And so thank you for everything you're doing in the Caribbean.
Excellent. Thank you.
And finally, we'd like to welcome Samuel Torre, the National Coordinator of the Volunteers Involving Organizations Network in Sierra Leone, to really reflect on volunteering in Sierra Leone and what enabling environments look like there. He is the coordinator for AVE's Global Network for Volunteer Leadership in Africa and a passionate supporter of volunteering in Sierra Leone, and was a former project support officer for VSO. So welcome, Samuel, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, David. Thanks. I think I have to move faster because of the time. Thanks a lot. Yeah, no need to introduce myself. I just want to run us through what we've been doing in Sierra Leone around creating an enabling environment and engaging volunteering, and also working with the government to make our work seen, giving more evidence to government, the inclusion of volunteering. Next slide, please. So this, we will be looking at the activities that we have been undertaking, the information about the network. We'll talk about our strength, and we're talking about our outreaches and activities that we are looking forward to have. Next slide, please. And of course, in Sierra Leone, we are the leading network of volunteers organizations that we've been working with a lot of organizations, including local and international players, and as well as the community-based organization and government institution too. We have also been involving the private sector into some of our work, giving them some chances to participate. Our office, we are hosted by one of the partners in the network, and it's at Pademba Road in Freetown. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we try to do when we establish Bionet from 2018 to now, before we had no strength on volunteering in 2014-15, we actually begin to realize the work of volunteers around 2018, when we started to bring other players on board. And Western area was been the kind of host area, which is the capital city, and this is where all these big organizations are. So what we decided to do is that we collaborated with some of the partners like VSO to establish regional network. That is to say, every region should be able to volunteer, not necessarily have to come to the city. So they can volunteer in the north. We have a regional network there that they can engage their various districts. So we have 4 regions in Sierra Leone, and then we have 16 districts across this 4 regions. Each region can then cascade volunteering work into the various districts. So we have a regional network comprised of local, international, and inclusive of government organizations who are part of the network at that level, and they operate at that level, and we work with them to that level, and they have their own local leadership. We actually just provide general oversight of their work. So we have the membership, the network across the 4 regions of Sierra Leone. Next slide, please. And when establishing it, what we try to do is to see how we can make them to be meaningful, and see how we can work in line with what the government national agenda. So one of the key ministry in Sierra Leone is the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development, and they are looking at their custodian of the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we're trying to do is to see how volunteers are able to contribute meaningfully, as well as providing concrete evidences to see how government can position volunteers in their plan. And that's by showing that we as civil society in the volunteer sector could be a formidable players, our frontline players in advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. So we train volunteers to be what SDGs ambassadors. 17 volunteers we are trained, and then they master each of these goals. One of their role is to see how they can localize the SDGs, bring in the SDGs to the communities, giving the communities the local ownership, building their capacity, but as well as monitor implementation from other MDAs on the SDGs and support reporting system back to the ministry. This helps to feed the voluntary national review process, but as well as able to support volunteer generally to be able to count on our effort and give government feedback as to how volunteers do contribute to this process. So we have been a formidable player in the voluntary national review since 2019 to now. At the moment, we are also supporting the voluntary local review, which the country is reviewing its own progress. Whilst we look forward to feed that report, volunteers have been in the front line as civil society players on the SDGs. So this is what we've been doing. We've also been monitoring the health sector, ensuring efficient and effective service delivery in the health system, and as well as looking at other areas where we feel, for example, the youth. We've also working with the Ministry of Youth in Sierra Leone to ensure that the review of the National Youth Policy was inclusive, ensuring that youths in deprived areas, in remote areas, our volunteers were able to engage, bringing their voices and encouraging them to come to validation processes for the first time. So we have been able to prove ourselves part of creating an enabling environment for meaningful policy formulation, but at the same time integrating volunteering into the national agenda. The next slide, please. Okay, so what we did here is that after all what we've been doing, so we thought it necessary to see how we should be talking with government around policy formulation. And that's involved looking at protection for volunteers in the first place, support for volunteers and recognitions in the kind of place. But again, how then do we build leadership, financing in general? So we thought it would be necessary with all what we've been doing that we start to engage our government for policy work. And then we had a very good meeting with the government to see what are the possibility of forming up a policy. Is the government ready? Unfortunately, we actually been able to have the government buying and kind of applauding the work of volunteers and the patriotic show to come forth and develop a policy that will protect volunteering, protect them, and as well as the type of what volunteering will look like, giving more relevance to volunteers, giving more motivation to the volunteers to come in. So we are now discussing with the government in terms of like signing a memorandum of understanding to start a policy formulation going forward, while the government is also keen to see how they can invest financially into the process and also calling the private sector. The government is also leading on that to see how investment for volunteering could come in and how that can be translated in the policy in general. So we are using other contexts as good practices. For example, we're exploring policies that work best in Kenya, in Rwanda, in Togo, to see how we get those samples and how we can inform our buying process. At the same time, we are looking at global standard, like for example, the global volunteering standard. We are looking at how then do we bring in those practices inside to develop one. The policy process should start anytime very soon in Sierra Leone. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we try to do in this context of where we organize activity, educative fair, it's a platform to showcase the work of volunteers from diverse sectors on the SDGs and for possible collaboration and networking. What we did here is that we brought all our memberships together across the country to a networking session on the SDGs. And then we invited the government, the private sector, and other corporate institutions, including the communities and other stakeholders, and to actually interface, understand what volunteering is in the Sierra Leone context, what are the opportunities available, how can they be able to seek proper networking, but at the same time, how can they support, what kind of corporate volunteering should be available or should we do in this kind of case. So in this program, we had government ministers. You can see the mayor there, the woman with the smiling, pleasant smile. She is the mayor of Freetown, was there to grace the occasion. This was a formidable event that actually opened the eyes of many actors, state and non-state actors, about volunteering and drew up their attention to support volunteering. So in the follow-up of this, we had the telecommunication companies feel that it was necessary for them to support most of the event that we do, but at the same time, how do they harness their own technology to do mapping of volunteering, to do education around volunteering, not seeing volunteering as idle as someone with a job. So this session was quite formidable, increasing partnership and also create awareness and provide support to volunteers. The next slide, please. So our work on emergency response has been for a very long time, and it continues during the COVID-19, where it was difficult in the beginning because we are now introducing ourselves to online volunteering, where we needed to conduct series of trainings for volunteers to understand emergency response, especially the complex one like COVID-19. And then we're looking at how online volunteering do help us as well to do this fund to support our volunteers in terms of raising awareness in the private communities, sharing of protective gears to workers and volunteers, but as well as looking at hand-washing materials, setting up hand-washing stations in other areas. We've been doing that during the COVID-19, but as all of you may have aware, Sierra Leone have been experiencing series of disasters recently. We've had kind of mudslides, we have a lot of floodings. So this is the fire disaster that happens in one of the community that left over 7,000 people displaced. Our volunteers, we are on the ground working with government and other sectors, including the other NGOs, partners on the ground, just provide emergency support in there. So we collaborated this one with VSO, and then also working on the ground with Caritas, and also the National Disaster Management Agency, which is the government agency for disaster, to support the emergency response from the beginning until the ending. And the volunteer, we are also there to provide recovery and psychosocial for people who are deeply affected by the disaster. So this work has been going on in the community. We are now currently supporting the community with further life skill and psychosocial support, which is ongoing in progress in the community, to ensure that youth who have been adversely affected are well placed to think informally and take up supports in terms of like getting back their livelihood and getting jobs, to ensure that they are able to be formidable citizens again as they were, that kind of are reintegrating them back into the communities. So that work, what we have been doing. In general, we have been actually using all of those work that we are engaging to now engage governments. While the government is thinking of reviewing a national agenda, we are also discussing with them in that national agenda they are reviewing. There should be inclusion of volunteers in that agenda, as well as a faction in that agenda to support the policy development in which the government is reviewing its budget for next year, to see how government can allocate finance to ensure that they support the policy development that promotes, protects, and recognize the work of volunteers at national level. So this is much of what we're doing. Next slide, please. Yes, so thank you so much. This is how we've been working in Sierra Leone, ensuring that an enabling environment is created, like I said, across, and this work is cascaded across the 4 regions. It's not just limited in the Western area, it's going on across. Thank you.
Great, thank you everyone. And I'd like to have all our panelists come back on screen, and I will ask sort of a final question of all of you, if you would like to give your final thoughts or comments based on many of the chat. Is there any final words of wisdom you would say about how to make sure policymakers understand and appreciate the role of volunteering, and how we can help amplify marginal voices, especially in hostile political environments? So that dual role of how do we get policymakers to understand the value of volunteering and amplify some of the voices who could really help policymakers understand those volunteering. So give each of you a minute or two to respond, and we'll start with you, Helene.
Thank you, David. Yes, I'd like to pick up on the point of research and evidence that Tapiwa spoke about and Giselle mentioned with such clarity, and I'm so taken by what the Caribbean Exchange Network is doing. I think unless one has that, it's very difficult to persuade policymakers to take this or that position and of support. So I definitely think collaboration for the development of research data and evidence, carefully argued and locally shaped in terms of the local interests and the government's particular priorities, would be absolutely critical. Thanks.
Thanks, Helene. And Tapiwa, any final thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. First, I want to acknowledge the colleagues' presentations and information. Excellent. I think we are sitting on a crossroads right now, where we need to drive volunteerism. What comes to mind always is the 2001, where the volunteering sector took a stand to say, we want to focus on advocacy, on promotion towards an enabling environment defined by policies, defined by laws, defined by this. The crossroads at which we are sitting right now, I think, is that of taking a new direction, the integration of volunteering into development frameworks. This is missing. It's not available. It's not there. It's absent. And this, I think, is the possibility for research, for evidence. The fact that we have volunteer policies across many countries and nothing is referred in the planning and implementation of development programs, I think it's a problem. It's problematic for me. So what we want to do now is more research, more data, more evidence that we can put forth for member states, for practitioners to say, here we are. we can do so much. For example, the little that we have done in Kenya, volunteerism contributing to 3.6 of the GDP, and in other places. Recently, I was in Kazakhstan. Great stuff on the contribution of volunteerism to development. I think this is the kind of information that we want to broker and bring up. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Viva. Giselle.
Yeah, so 2 words, research and collaboration. In terms of research, what I do want to say at this point is we understand that sometimes these initiatives, they do require resources, they require funding, they require people and whatnot. As volunteer involving organizations, national leadership organizations, sometimes we need to get very creative and also be willing to take small steps towards those bigger goals. A couple years ago, VCTT had as an objective a national survey on volunteering, but we did not have the capacity. We engaged our local university and instead undertook to carry out an online survey as one step towards that process. So having a clear goal, right? Defining a pathway towards that goal, and also collaboration. Collaboration is absolutely key. We need to understand who we need to have at the table in terms of engaging government, and that may mean not only government may need to be at the table. So research and collaboration.
Great. Thank you, Giselle. And Samuel, thank you for your presentation. Any final comments?
So yeah, I was muted. So I think I want to agree more with Tapiwa's comment. I think we need to look at the point where is that we need to have a kind of a concrete evidences and the kind of a good data that can be able to convince state actors, especially looking at the enabling environment to be created here. Looking at for us in the Global South, where is that you have a kind of a little low government support to volunteering. They needed to see the kind of more evidences, good data that can see how volunteers contribute to their programs that can convince them to support. So I feel it's just similarly to what Giselle just talked about. Enough research, good data, and good evidence can then transform the minds of our local leaders to invest in volunteering. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all for your presentations. And I encourage all of you to think about your own volunteer ecosystems. What are the things that are going well that you can strengthen? What are some of those barriers and challenges that you need to overcome? And how can we just help continue to build collaborations among ourselves, with other civil society organizations, with corporations, with governments, and continue the research and provide the evidence of the incredible impact that we know volunteers are making. Again, please consider attending the IAVE World Volunteer Conference next month. And also the most recent research that was done was on corporate volunteering. So please look for that. Look at these research programs and projects and look at what you can do in your own countries and communities to add to this wealth of knowledge that we are building. Please be in touch if we can be of any assistance, and thank you all for your participation today. Thank you again to our panelists, and have a wonderful rest of the week.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye.